Commander Thexicon had dealt with plenty of difficult prisoners in his 23 years of service to the Galactic Council. He'd interrogated war criminals who laughed in his face, terrorists who spat acid at his boots, and pirates who tried to bribe him with the locations of hidden treasure fleets. But none of them, absolutely none, had ever brought their own cheering section to a formal detention hearing. "Captain Wren," he said, his reptilian voice dripping with the kind of patience that suggested he was about 3 seconds away from losing it entirely. "I must insist that you order these cubs to return to the juvenile holding area." The human woman sitting across from him didn't even look up from where she was gently untangling a knot in Dash's fur. The small Valaxian cub had somehow managed to get his head stuck between the interrogation table's support bars, a feat that should have been physically impossible, given that he could phase through solid matter when he wanted to. But apparently, panic made even the most gifted cubs forget their abilities. "They're not under my command anymore, Thexcon," Wren replied, her tone as dry as Kepler Station's recycled air. "Haven't been for 3 months. You're the ones who declared me a prisoner of war, remember?" Crystal, the young Karathi sitting on the floor beside Wren's chair, chose that moment to create a shimmering hard-light butterfly that fluttered directly in front of the commander's face. The crystalline cub's attempt at distraction might have been more effective if she hadn't been giggling the entire time. Thexcon's tail twitched, a sure sign that his legendary composure was starting to crack. "Nevertheless, they clearly respond to your authority. A simple request from you would—" "Would what?" Wren finally looked up, and Thexcon was reminded why humans had such an uncomfortable reputation in Council space. Those predator eyes didn't miss anything. "Would make them abandon the one person who kept them alive during the worst 6 months of their lives? Sorry, Commander, but that's not happening." On cue, because apparently the universe had a sense of humor, Ink chose that moment to squeeze through the gap between Wren's chair and the wall, their tentacles making a soft squelching sound that echoed in the sterile room. The young Nephirin emerged clutching a small data pad they'd somehow acquired from somewhere. Thexcon made a mental note to have security sweep the room again. How many hiding spots could one interrogation chamber possibly have? "Look," Buzz whispered from his perch on the table, his chitinous shell gleaming under the harsh lights. "Look, the angry lizard's tail is doing the twitchy thing again. 6 pairs of alien eyes, plus 2 disturbingly amused human ones, turned to stare at Thexcon's traitorous appendage. Glow helpfully provided a soft bioluminescent spotlight, just in case anyone had missed the show. "My tail does not twitch," Thexcon ground out through clenched teeth. "It totally does," Echo piped up, and the little resonance voice was a perfect mimicry of Thexicon's own formal tone. "My tail does not twitch. See? Exactly like that." The sound of muffled laughter from the observation deck above didn't help Thexcon's mood. He'd specifically requested a private hearing, but apparently the brass wanted to watch this particular interrogation unfold, probably taking bets on how long it would take him to crack. "Captain Wren," he tried again, "you are facing serious charges related to the events at Kepler Research Station, the unauthorized deployment of non-combatant aliens in military operations, endangering the welfare of miners, violation of the sanctuary protocols. These cubs would be better served by—" "By what?" Wren's voice had gone quiet, and somehow that was infinitely more dangerous than if she'd started shouting. "By being locked away in some council facility where they can be properly cared for by beings who've never met them, where they can be studied and categorized and turned into statistics for your reports. Dash finally worked his head free from the table supports and immediately scrambled up onto Ren's lap. The small Valaxian's fur was standing on end, a sign of distress that even Thexcon's xenobiology training could recognize. "The captain stayed," Dash said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When the bad bugs came, when everyone else ran, she stayed." "We know," Crystal added, her hard light butterfly dissolving as she reached over to pat Dash's paw. "We remember." And there it was, the crux of the matter that had been driving Thexcon to distraction for 3 solid months. 6 alien cubs from 6 different species, each with their own unique abilities and cultural backgrounds, all absolutely united in their loyalty to one human soldier. It defied every xenopsychological model the Council had on file. "What did you do to them?" The question slipped out before Thexcon could stop it, and immediately he regretted the phrasing. It sounded accusatory, suspicious, exactly the kind of leading question his training had taught him to avoid. But Ren just smiled, and it wasn't the bitter expression he'd been expecting. It was soft, almost fond, as she looked down at the collection of young aliens who'd turned her interrogation into something resembling a very unusual family gathering. "I never left," she said simply. "That's not an answer." "Sure it is." Ren's hand found Ink's tentacle and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You want to know why they won't leave my side? It's because I never left theirs. Not when the Ravenous hit the station. Not when Command ordered a tactical retreat. Not when every adult with half a brain was running for the evacuation shuttles." Her eyes met his, and Thexicon felt an uncomfortable chill run down his spine. "I stayed, Commander, and I taught them that sometimes staying is the bravest thing you can do." "The sanctuary protocols exist for a reason," Thexcon insisted. "Cubs are non-combatants. They're supposed to be evacuated first, protected from—" "Protected?" Glow's bioluminescence flared brighter, casting strange shadows on the walls. "Protected like the cubs on the transport ships that got caught by the Ravenous fleet? Protected like the ones who made it to the safe evacuation zones and got picked off one by one?" Echo nodded vigorously. The screaming on the comm channels stopped being background noise after the first day. After that, it was just quiet. The observation deck had gone silent. Thexcon could practically feel the weight of his superior's attention pressing down on him. This wasn't how the interrogation was supposed to go. The human was supposed to break down, confess to her crimes, maybe shed a few tears about the terrible burden of command. She wasn't supposed to sit there calmly while 6 alien cubs painted a picture of systematic evacuation failure that made the Council's official reports look like propaganda pieces. "You're saying the evacuation protocols failed," Thexcon said carefully. "I'm saying your evacuation protocols assumed the Ravenous would follow the rules of civilized warfare," Ren replied. "Big mistake. Turns out, slavers who specialize in harvesting gifted cubs don't really care about your carefully negotiated treaties." Buzz's antennae twitched. "They knew we were there. All of us. They had files. Names, abilities, even our favorite hiding spots," Crystal added, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that only cubs could manage when discussing their own near-death experiences. Like someone had been watching us for months. Thexcon felt his carefully prepared line of questioning crumbling like a house built on quicksand. That's impossible. Kepler Station was a civilian research facility. The location was classified, the personnel roster was sealed, and yet, somehow, the Ravenous showed up with a shopping list, Ren interrupted. "Funny how that works." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the cubs settling more comfortably around their chosen protector. Dash had curled up on Wren's lap and was purring, a sound that shouldn't have been possible given Valaxian physiology. But there it was. Ink had wrapped two tentacles around Wren's wrist like living bracelets. Crystal was methodically braiding patterns of light through her fingers, a nervous habit that Thexcon had noted in his files. "Tell me about the siege," he said finally. Wren was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much and remembered every detail. "You want to know what really happened at Kepler Station? Fine. But don't expect it to fit neatly into your incident reports." She looked up at the observation deck, and Thexcon could swear he saw her smile. "See, the thing about humans is that we've got this nasty habit of adapting to circumstances. And when circumstances involve a bunch of scared, gifted cubs and a swarm of slavers who want to bag them like trophies, well..." She paused, and every cub in the room leaned forward slightly, as if they were about to hear their favorite bedtime story. "Well," Wren continued, "let's just say that sometimes the best way to protect someone isn't to hide them away. Sometimes you teach them to fight back." Thexcon's tail, which definitely did not twitch, regardless of what certain cubs might claim, betrayed him again. Because something in Wren's tone suggested that the real story was just beginning, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that everything he thought he knew about the Kepler Station incident was about to be turned upside down. "Captain Wren," he said slowly, "are you telling me that you turned 6 alien cubs into soldiers?" "No, Commander," she replied, and her smile was sharp enough to cut steel. "I'm telling you that I turned 6 alien cubs into survivors. There's a difference." Echo's perfect mimicry of Thexcon's earlier tone drifted through the room. "There's a difference." But this time, nobody laughed. This time, everyone was listening. 6 months earlier, Kepler Research Station had been the kind of place that made Galactic Council bureaucrats write glowing reports about interspecies cooperation and scientific advancement. A gleaming testament to what could be achieved when different worlds worked together, complete with artificial gravity that didn't make anyone nauseous, and coffee that only tasted slightly like engine lubricant. Captain Wren had been stationed there for exactly 18 days when everything went sideways, and she'd spent most of those 18 days wondering what she'd done to deserve babysitting duty on a glorified space laboratory. Her official assignment was security liaison, a fancy way of saying she was supposed to stand around looking military while actual smart people did actual smart things. The irony wasn't lost on her that the most boring assignment of her career was about to become the most important. "Captain, we've got incoming ships on long-range sensors," Lieutenant Ben's voice crackled through her comm unit, with the kind of forced calm that meant someone was trying very hard not to panic. "Multiple contacts, moving fast, and they're not responding to hails." Wren was already moving before he finished the sentence, muscle memory taking over as she headed for the command center. Kepler Station's corridors were designed for efficiency rather than speed, all smooth curves and rounded corners that were supposed to promote psychological well-being. Right now, they just seemed like obstacles. "How many is multiple?" she asked, dodging around a maintenance droid that was apparently having an existential crisis about whether to continue polishing the floor or seek shelter. A lot, Captain. Like, maybe we should have invested in better defensive systems, a lot." The command center was chaos when she arrived, the kind of organized chaos that happened when very smart people suddenly realized that all their theoretical knowledge about emergency procedures was about to become very practical very quickly. Dr. Holly was bent over a sensor console, her usually perfect hair escaping its ponytail in wispy strands that suggested she'd been running her hands through it. "Talk to me, Doc," Wren said, sliding into the tactical station with the ease of long practice. "Unknown fleet. Definitely not Council Registry," Holly replied without looking up. 18 ships in the initial wave, with more jumping in every few minutes. Configuration matches ravenous design patterns, but the sensor readings are weird. Weird how? Weird like they're specifically equipped for capture operations rather than destruction. Enhanced tractor beams, boarding pods, specialized containment systems. Holly finally looked up, and her face was pale. "Wren, they're not here to blow us up. They're here to take us." The first impact hit the station 30 seconds later, a shuddering jolt that sent coffee mugs flying and made the lights flicker in that ominous way that suggested someone had just done very expensive damage to very important systems. Emergency klaxons began wailing, adding their voice to the symphony of impending doom. "All hands! This is Captain Wren," she announced over the station-wide communication. "We are under attack by hostile forces. Initiate evacuation protocol Omega. All non-essential personnel to evacuation stations immediately. Security teams to defensive positions." It sounded calm, professional, exactly like the sort of thing they taught you to say in crisis management classes. What they didn't teach you was how to sound calm when you were looking at sensor readings that showed your tiny research station surrounded by enough firepower to turn a small moon into space debris. "Captain," Ben's voice was tight with concern. "The evacuation bays are reporting problems. The Cubs, they're not responding to standard evacuation procedures." Of course they weren't, because in all their careful planning and protocol development, nobody had really considered what would happen when you tried to evacuate a mixed group of alien youngsters who'd never experienced actual combat before. The research station housed Cubs from 6 different species, each with their own unique psychological profiles and stress responses. "Where are they?" Wren asked, already knowing she wasn't going to like the answer. "Scattered throughout the research levels." Dash phased through a wall and disappeared into the ventilation system. "Crystal created some kind of light maze in Laboratory C, and nobody can find her in it. Ink squeezed into a maintenance shaft that's too small for anyone else to follow. The others are hiding," Wren finished, "because that's what Cubs do when they're terrified." Another impact, this one closer, sent vibrations through the deck plating. Through the viewports, she could see the distinctive insectoid shapes of ravenous boarding craft latching onto the station's outer hull like mechanical parasites. The evacuation protocol called for all non-combatants to be off the station within 20 minutes of the first alarm. They were already past the 15-minute mark. "Ma'am," one of the sensor technicians called out, "I'm reading massive power fluctuations from the evacuation bays. The transport ships they're not launching." "What do you mean, they're not launching?" "The Ravenous have deployed some kind of disruption field. It's not stopping our ships from starting up, but the moment they try to break orbit—" The technician's voice trailed off as another blip disappeared from his screen. "That's the 4th transport we've lost contact with." Holly was staring at her console with the expression of someone who'd just realized that all her careful evacuation plans were worth exactly nothing. "They're picking off the transports as fast as we can launch them. It's like they know exactly where to wait." "Because they do know," Wren said grimly. "This isn't a random raid. They came here specifically for our Cubs." The realization hit the command center like a physical blow. Everyone had heard the stories about ravenous slaving operations, but they were the kind of horror stories that happened to other people, in other systems, far away from civilized space. The idea that someone would dare attack a council research station was unthinkable. The idea that they would do it specifically to steal cubs was worse than unthinkable. It was obscene. "New plan," Wren announced, her voice cutting through the growing panic. "Forget the evacuation protocols. We're not abandoning ship." "Captain," Holly started, "the regulations clearly state—" "The regulations assume we have somewhere safe to run to," Wren interrupted. "Right now, the safest place for those cubs is right here, with us." Ben was staring at her like she'd just suggested they fight the ravenous fleet with harsh language and good intentions. "Ma'am, with respect, we've got maybe 30 security personnel and some very smart scientists. They've got enough firepower to glass this station." "They've also got a problem," Wren pointed out. "Dead cubs don't sell for much on the slave markets. They need to take this station mostly intact, which means they can't just blow us out of space. They have to come in and get us the hard way." She was already moving toward the armory, her mind racing through tactical possibilities. The research station wasn't designed as a fortress, but it had advantages that a traditional military installation might not. Complicated interior layout, multiple levels with varying gravity orientations, and a population that included some very gifted young aliens who were scared enough to be dangerous. "Holly, I need everything you can tell me about the Cubs' abilities, not the theoretical stuff from their files, the real capabilities they've demonstrated during their time here. Wren, you can't seriously be thinking about using them in saving their own lives?" "Yeah, Doc, that's exactly what I'm thinking." Wren paused at the armory door, her hand on the access panel. "Those cubs didn't choose to be here when the Ravenous showed up, but now that they are here, they deserve better than being told to hide in a corner while the adults get them all killed." The station shuddered again, and this time the lights didn't flicker. They went out entirely for a heart-stopping moment before the emergency power kicked in. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the distinctive whine of cutting tools as the Ravenous began their boarding operation. "Time's up," Wren muttered, punching in her access code. "Ben, get me a direct line to every section of the station. I need to talk to our cubs." "Captain, if Command finds out you're planning to arm non-combatants—" "Then Command can court-martial me later," Wren replied, grabbing a pulse rifle from the weapon rack, "assuming any of us are still alive to face charges." The comm system squealed with feedback before settling into a steady hum. Throughout the research station, in hiding spots ranging from ventilation shafts to laboratory storage closets, 6 very scared alien cubs suddenly heard a human voice cutting through the chaos. "Dash! Crystal! Ink! Buzz! Glow! Echo! This is Captain Wren. I know you're listening, and I know you're scared. That's smart. Being scared means you're paying attention." She paused, choosing her words carefully, because what she said next was either going to save their lives or get them all killed. "I'm not going to lie to you. The bad guys are already on the station, and the evacuation plan isn't working. But that doesn't mean we're giving up. It just means we're going to try something different." Another pause, longer this time, as she let that sink in. "I'm coming to find each of you, and when I do, we're going to have a very important conversation about what it means to fight back. Not because you have to, but because you can. And because sometimes the only way to protect the people you care about is to refuse to run away." The comm channel stayed open for a moment longer, filled with the ambient noise of a research station under siege. Then Wren clicked it off and headed into the maze of corridors that would either become a battlefield or a tomb, depending on whether 6 alien cubs were ready to learn that sometimes being small didn't mean being helpless. Behind her, The command center continued its controlled chaos, but now there was something different in the air. Not hope, exactly, but something harder and more dangerous. The kind of stubborn determination that had made humans notorious throughout the galaxy for refusing to know when they were beaten. Finding Dash turned out to be easier than Ren had expected, mostly because the little Valaxian had gotten himself thoroughly stuck in an air vent and was making the kind of distressed chittering noises that echoed through half the station's ventilation system. "Hey there, Furball," Ren said softly, crouching down beside the vent grate. "Having some technical difficulties?" A muffled whimper came from inside the duct, followed by what sounded like frantic scratching. Dash's phasing ability was incredibly useful when he was calm and focused, but panic had a way of making even the most gifted cubs forget they had options. I can't make it work." Dash's voice was barely audible through the metal. "I keep trying to phase, but I'm stuck, and there are bad sounds coming from everywhere, and I don't know where the others are, and—" "Breathe," Ren interrupted gently. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Just like Dr. Holly taught you during those meditation sessions you thought were boring." She could hear him trying to follow her instructions, his breathing gradually slowing from panicked gasps to something more controlled. While she waited, she kept one ear tuned to the corridor behind her, where the distant sounds of cutting tools and shouted orders suggested the ravenous boarding parties were making steady progress through the outer sections. "Better?" she asked after a moment. "A little." Dash's voice was steadier now. "Captain Wren? Are we all going to die?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut, because it was exactly the kind of brutally honest inquiry that cubs specialized in. No dancing around the issue, no polite euphemisms, just a simple request for information about their chances of survival. "Not if I can help it," she replied, "but I need your help to make sure that happens." "My help? But I'm just a cub. I can't fight giant bug monsters." "You're right," Ren agreed. "You can't fight them the way an adult would, but you can do things that no adult can do. Things that might just save all our lives." She could practically hear him thinking, his breathing still steady but thoughtful now instead of panicked. "Like what?" "Like walking through walls to get where they can't follow you. Like being our eyes and ears in places they'll never think to look. Like being so small and quick that they'll never catch you, even if they do spot you." The scratching sounds resumed, but this time they were purposeful rather than frantic. A moment later, Dash's furry head poked through the solid metal of the vent grate, his large eyes reflecting the emergency lighting. "I can do that," he said quietly, "but I'm still scared." "Good," Ren replied. "Scared means you'll be careful. Careful means you'll stay alive." She held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Dash phased the rest of the way through the grate and into her arms. He was trembling, but his fur wasn't standing on end anymore. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Finding Crystal was significantly more complicated, mostly because the young Karathi had responded to the invasion by turning Laboratory C into something that looked like the inside of a kaleidoscope, having an argument with a prism factory. "Crystal?" Ren called out, as she stepped carefully into what had once been a perfectly normal xenobiology lab. "I know you're in here somewhere." The response was a shifting maze of hard light constructs that danced and flickered around the room in patterns that made her eyes water. Holographic butterflies the size of dinner plates swooped past her head, while geometric shapes that definitely hadn't been covered in basic geometry class rotated slowly in midair. "This is really impressive," Ren continued, keeping her voice calm and conversational. "But I'm betting you're getting tired from maintaining all of this." The light show flickered slightly, just enough to confirm her suspicion. Creating hard light illusions took concentration and energy, and Crystal had been at this for nearly 30 minutes now. "Here's what I think," Ren said, settling down cross-legged in the middle of the chaos. "I think you're scared that if you drop the illusions, the bad guys will be able to find you. But I also think you're smart enough to know that you can't keep this up forever." More flickering, and this time she caught a glimpse of crystalline features in the corner, where the light patterns seemed to originate. "What if I told you that instead of using your abilities to hide from the ravenous, we could use them to confuse them, to make them see things that aren't there, or miss things that are?" The butterflies slowed their frantic swooping, hovering uncertainly in the air. "You mean, trick them?" Crystal's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filtered through layers of refracted light. "I mean, turn your gift into the kind of tactical advantage that wins battles," Ren replied. "The ravenous are expecting to fight scared cubs hiding in corners. They're not expecting to fight cubs who fight back." The light maze collapsed all at once, leaving Crystal standing in the corner with her hands pressed against her temples and exhaustion written across her angular features. But there was something else there, too. A spark of interest that hadn't been there before. "You really think we can beat them?" she asked. "I think we can make them very sorry they decided to mess with us," Ren replied. Ink required a different approach entirely, mostly because the young Nephirin had managed to squeeze into a maintenance shaft that was approximately the diameter of a dinner plate and showed no inclination to come out. "I'm not going anywhere," Ink's muffled voice echoed through the narrow space. "This is safe, small and safe, and they can't get me here." "You're absolutely right," Ren agreed, sitting down beside the shaft opening. "It is safe, but it's also a dead end." Silence from the shaft, broken only by the distant sounds of the ongoing invasion. "The thing about hiding," Ren continued, "is that it only works if the bad guys eventually go away. But these particular bad guys aren't going away. They're going to keep looking until they find everyone they came for." "Then I'll hide better," Ink replied stubbornly. "For how long? Days? Weeks? What happens when you get hungry or thirsty, or when you just can't stand being cramped in there anymore?" More silence, but this time she could hear the soft sound of tentacles shifting against metal, a nervous habit she'd observed in Ink during their previous interactions. "There's another option," Ren said carefully. "Instead of hiding from them, we could use your ability to move through impossible spaces to our advantage. Think about it. You can go places they can't follow, reach things they can't touch, escape from situations that would trap anyone else. But what if I mess up? What if I get caught?" "Then you do what any smart cub would do," Ren replied. "You squeeze into the nearest impossible space and wait for backup." It took another 10 minutes of patient conversation, but eventually Ink emerged from the maintenance shaft like a very cautious octopus, tentacles testing the air before committing to full exposure. "I'm still scared," Ink admitted. "Join the club," Ren said. "But scared and helpless are two different things." Buzz was hiding in the acoustic dampening chamber, which made perfect sense given his enhanced hearing. The poor cub had probably been overwhelmed by the cacophony of emergency alarms, shouting voices, and the general chaos of an invasion. When Ren found him, he was curled up in the center of the room with his antennae pressed flat against his head. "Too loud," he whispered, without looking up. "Everything's too loud and wrong and scary." "I know," Ren said, keeping her voice soft. "But that enhanced hearing of yours isn't just picking up scary sounds. It's picking up useful ones, too." Buzz's antennae twitched slightly. Like what? Like exactly where the ravenous are, and how many of them, and what direction they're moving. Wren settled down beside him, careful not to make any sudden noises. Your hearing is better than any sensor equipment we have on this station. But listening hurts when everything's so loud and chaotic. What if we found ways to make it hurt less? And what if we used what you hear to help protect everyone else? It was a delicate negotiation, but eventually Buzz agreed to try, with the understanding that if it became too overwhelming, he could retreat back to the acoustic chamber at any time. Glow was attempting to hide in the power distribution center, which would have been a brilliant plan if not for the fact that her bioluminescence made her stick out like a beacon in the darkened room. "Points for creativity," Wren said as she approached the softly glowing cub, "but I think there might be a flaw in your camouflage strategy." "I was trying to blend in with the equipment lights," Glow replied defensively. "It almost worked." "It did almost work," Wren agreed. "And that gives me an idea. What if instead of trying to hide your light, we used it to blind the bad guys, or to signal to the others, or to make the ravenous think they're seeing things that aren't really there?" Glow's luminescence flickered with interest. "Like a living flashbang?" "Among other things, yes." Echo was the hardest to find, partly because the young resonant had been using their voice mimicry to throw off searchers by imitating the sounds of various station systems. Wren finally tracked them down by following a series of increasingly desperate fake evacuation announcements. "That's a really good impression of Commander Thexcon," Wren said when she finally cornered Echo in a supply closet. "Though I'm pretty sure his voice doesn't usually crack like that when he's nervous." Echo's form shifted slightly, another of their abilities, though limited to minor alterations in appearance. "I was trying to sound more authoritative. You were trying to take control of a situation that felt completely out of control," Wren corrected gently. "That's not a bad instinct. But what if we channeled it in a more effective direction?" "Like what?" "Like using your voice to confuse our enemies, instead of just trying to reassure our friends." Once she'd gathered all 6 cubs in the main laboratory, a process that took nearly 2 hours, and tested every patience-building exercise she'd ever learned, Wren faced the most difficult part of her impromptu plan: explaining to a group of terrified young aliens why their best chance of survival involved doing exactly the opposite of everything they'd been taught about staying safe. "The ravenous are expecting us to follow standard evacuation procedures," she began, addressing the small group that had arranged itself in a rough semicircle around her. "They're expecting scared cubs hiding in corners while the adults try to get them to safety." Dash's ears twitched. "But that's exactly what we were doing." "Right. Which is why it wasn't working." Wren leaned forward, making eye contact with each cub in turn. "The thing about expectations is that you can use them as weapons. If someone expects you to run, you can surprise them by standing your ground. If they expect you to hide, you can surprise them by attacking." "But we're just cubs," Crystal protested. "We don't know how to fight." "You don't know how to fight like adults," Wren corrected, "but you have abilities that most adults don't. And more importantly, you have something the ravenous don't expect: the willingness to work together." She gestured to the collection of species represented in the room. 6 different worlds, 6 different evolutionary paths, 6 completely different sets of natural abilities. Individually, you're scared cubs. Together, you're something the ravenous have never encountered before. Buzz's antennae perked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're going to turn this station into the most confusing, frustrating, impossible hunting ground the ravenous have ever seen. Wren's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. And we're going to do it by teaching you cubs that sometimes the best way to survive is to refuse to be prey. The next 4 hours were a masterclass in adaptive tactical innovation, as 6 alien cubs learned that their unique gifts could be weapons just as easily as they could be sources of wonder. Dash became their scout and saboteur, phasing through walls to disable equipment and gather intelligence. Crystal turned the station's corridors into a maze of false passages and phantom threats. Ink squeezed through impossible spaces to plant surprises in locations the ravenous would never think to check. Buzz monitored enemy movements with his enhanced hearing, providing early warning of approaching danger. Glow created diversions and distractions with precisely timed light shows. Echo confused enemy communications by mimicking orders and creating false reports. And through it all, Wren found herself learning as much as she was teaching. Because it turned out that cubs who were fighting for their lives and the lives of their friends were capable of tactical innovations that would have made seasoned military strategists weep with envy. "Captain," Holly's voice crackled through the comm system as the station's improvised defense entered its 3rd hour. "I'm reading massive confusion in the ravenous ranks. They're reporting contradictory intelligence, getting lost in corridors they've already mapped, and generally acting like they have no idea what they're dealing with." "That's because they don't," Wren replied, watching as Crystal created a perfect holographic duplicate of a ravenous soldier in the corridor outside their current hideout. When the real patrol rounded the corner and found themselves face to face with their own reflection, the resulting confusion bought them another 20 minutes of breathing room. "The casualty reports are unusual," Holly continued. "They're losing personnel, but not to direct combat. Equipment failures, navigational errors, what look like accidents, but happen with suspicious frequency." Wren glanced around at her unlikely squad of junior commandos, each of whom was grinning with the kind of fierce satisfaction that came from discovering you were much more dangerous than anyone had given you credit for. "Turns out," she said into the comm, "cubs make excellent guerrilla fighters when they put their minds to it." But even as she said it, she knew their luck couldn't hold forever. The ravenous might be confused and frustrated, but they weren't stupid. Eventually, they'd adapt their tactics, bring in heavier equipment, or simply decide that dead cubs were better than no cubs at all, which meant it was time for the final phase of their defense, the part where they stopped running and hiding and fighting from the shadows, the part where they made their stand. Back in the detention facility, Commander Thexcon watched as 6 alien cubs unconsciously arranged themselves in a defensive formation around their human protector. It wasn't deliberate, just muscle memory from months of working as a coordinated team, but it was telling. "The reactor core," he said quietly. "That's where you made your final stand." Wren nodded, her hand absently stroking Dash's fur. "The ravenous finally figured out what we were doing. Brought in trackers, heavy equipment, started sealing off sections of the station systematically. We had maybe an hour before they cornered us." "So you retreated to the most dangerous place on the station." Thexcon's tail twitched, just once. "The regulations specifically forbid non-combatants from entering reactor spaces. The regulations didn't account for non-combatants who could phase through radiation shielding, create hard light barriers, or squeeze through maintenance conduits that led directly to the core's control systems." Wren's smile was fond, proud. "Turns out, when you're fighting for your life, forbidden becomes just another word." Echo spoke up, their voice a perfect mimicry of an official council announcement. Emergency Protocol 99 Alpha. In cases of imminent station destruction, all regulations are suspended in favor of survival. I don't recall that being an actual protocol, Thexcon said dryly. It wasn't, Crystal admitted, her hard light butterflies dancing around her fingers. We made it up, but it sounded official. In the reactor core, with the ravenous closing in from all sides and nowhere left to run, something extraordinary had happened. The Cubs had stopped looking to Wren for orders and started anticipating each other's moves. Dash phased through the core housing to reach manual overrides. Crystal created a maze of false passages that led the ravenous in circles. Ink squeezed into spaces that shouldn't have existed to plant charges on critical systems. They were going to take us, Glow said softly, her bioluminescence dimming with the memory. The ravenous leader said dead cubs were better than free cubs. So we made sure there wouldn't be any cubs left to take, Buzz added, his antennae twitching with remembered satisfaction. Thexcon leaned forward. You're telling me you were prepared to destroy the reactor core rather than be captured? We were prepared to convince them that we might destroy the reactor core, Wren corrected. There's a difference. Though honestly, at that point, we were all scared enough that we might actually have gone through with it. But we didn't have to, Ink said, their tentacles weaving together in complex patterns. Because they believed us. Because we'd already shown them that we weren't helpless prey. The truth was simpler and more complex than any official report could capture. In those final moments, faced with the choice between capture and mutual destruction, the Cubs hadn't looked to their human protector for salvation. They'd looked to each other, and then they'd looked to her, and the message in their eyes hadn't been, "Save us." It had been, "We're with you, whatever happens." The ravenous withdrew, Thexicon said slowly. They had overwhelming force, tactical superiority, and you trapped in the reactor core. But they withdrew. Funny thing about slavers, Wren replied. They're in it for profit, not principle. Dead cubs don't generate revenue, and exploded space stations don't generate anything but debris fields. But the real reason they left, Crystal said quietly, was because they realized we weren't cubs anymore. Not the kind they could just bag and tag and sell. We were something else, Echo agreed. Something they didn't have a plan for. Thexcon stared at the small group, understanding finally dawning. You weren't just protecting them from the ravenous. You were teaching them to protect themselves from anyone who would prey on them. I was teaching them that being small doesn't mean being powerless, Wren said. That being young doesn't mean being helpless. That being different from everyone else isn't a weakness. It's a strength that nobody sees coming. Dash looked up at her with adoring eyes. She taught us. We could fight back. More than that, Ink added. She taught us we could win. In the observation deck above, the council officials who had come to watch a war criminal's interrogation were witnessing something else entirely. The testimony of 6 beings who had been transformed from victims into survivors, from prey into predators, from helpless cubs into something the galaxy had never seen before. Young aliens who refused to be anyone's victims, trained by a human who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness was teaching someone to fight for themselves. The charges, Thexcon said quietly. We'll stand, Wren replied without hesitation. I violated protocols, endangered minors, and turned cubs into combatants. The book says I'm guilty. But we're alive, Buzz pointed out. All of us. The book didn't save us. She did. We all did, Crystal corrected. Together. And in that moment, Commander Thexcon realized that he wasn't interrogating a war criminal at all. He was trying to prosecute someone for the crime of teaching cubs that they didn't have to stay victims forever. The problem was, looking at 6 confident, capable young beings who had chosen their protector rather than being assigned to her, he wasn't sure that was actually a crime worth punishing, even if the regulations said otherwise.